Shalom, shalom, everybody. Ariel Tzadok here from the KosherTorah School, found online at www.koshertorah.com, bringing to you lesson number 9 in our series, which I've called the Biblical Origins of the Prophetic Kabbalah, the saga, the teachings of what was Eliyahu HaNavi and now Elisha HaNavi. We are going to learn chapter 6 in 2 Kings tonight. Jumped over chapter 5 because there's a lesson that I want to teach in chapter 6, and that's why we're here. I'll probably go back to chapter 5 just to cover 2, be comprehensive. But we're going to discuss a couple of issues. I mean, you can read the biblical story. It's going to tell you the story of the floating of the axe head and the army that came to get Elisha and all that fun stuff that happened with it. Now, when you read these biblical stories, we read stories like we, unfortunately, or I don't know, read all the other kinds of stories. Think about it. When you read a story in the Bible, if you are a believer, then that story is, of course, truth and reality, etc. But for those who lack such emunah faith, then the story in the Bible is really no different from any other story that's told around the world. Now, you need to understand why or how or what it's all about from the point of view of heaven. Or if you will, the higher psychic powers, or if you'll allow me to say, the ways of the force, as you're about to see. Understand something. Again, we've covered this in everything that I teach here at our KosherTorah school. Our reality, everything that we know, is energy. I don't know what energy is. You don't know what energy is. All we can do is define it by describing it with names that we understand. We call the energy consciousness, thought, mind, or life force, etc. When we look at the name of God in the Bible, Yud-Keh, Vav-Keh, Hashem, you will notice that the name is based upon an actual verb in Hebrew. Yud, and then you have, of course, Hey Vav Hey. Hey Vav Hey is a verb, Hoveh, which means to be. It's the action verb. And it is, like all verb roots, in the passive tense. But when you add a prefix of the letter Yod, you take a passive verb and you make it active. So the name Yud with Hey Vav Hey Hoveh would be active being or being in action. So God's name in the Bible is not Yahweh, Jehovah, or any other kind of personification in some kind of an individual form. You see, that was one of the major revelations and insights since the days of Mount Sinai. You remember good old Mount Sinai, the 10 Commandments. No images are you allowed to make. No pictures, no nothing, not of the heavens above, not of the earth beneath, not even of good old Sierra sitting behind me on the couch over there. Nothing, nada, klum. And when the children of Israel couldn't handle the nebulousness of that, and they said, we want to congeal an image of the universal power. So they looked at the universal force at the time as an astrological expression and came up with the golden calf. Well, God said, no, that's bad. We all know the story, what happened with that. But as we know from the story, God forgave them because he recognized that the intellectual abilities of a nation just coming out of slavery was kind of limited. And to ask them to accept or embrace such a grandiose experience, even though they had experienced Sinai, it takes time for that experience to, if you will, digest in the mind. Yeah, that was a big deal. Now, Juxtapose that to today. You know, for those of you who don't already know, our governments know a heck of a lot more about what's, out there that we are ever going to find out, because they know, like, if you will, it was known in the days of Mount Sinai. There's only so much people can handle. This is the metaphor as used by the Arizal, Chaim Vital, where he speaks of the creation of evil being what's called the shattering of the vessels, which means that the, in quote, light was so powerful that the vessel couldn't handle it. Or, in the words of another movie out of Hollywood, you can't handle the truth. While in the olden days of creation, the original vessels couldn't handle that truth, and it perverted things. And, well, here we are today with the mistakes of the intellect, the tree of knowledge, good and evil, of which, unfortunately, many people still eat from on a daily basis today. But understanding what was in ancient Israel, most of the rank and file still had a concept of God which was not really that different from the nations around them. And essentially, they actually had in the back of their heads, all right, my God's bigger than your God. My God's bigger than yours. All right. That's, an old, pun on an old commercial for dog food. Coloration, if I'm not mistaken. No, I'm showing my age here, I know. But anyway, my point is, understand that what the prophets knew and what the people knew, there was a big difference between the two. So even since biblical times, you had your, if you will, inner circle. They were mostly Kohanim priests, Levites, and of course the school of the prophets. Those who had the elite training to be able to know and experience the greater, higher values of the reality around us. So they knew and understood that God, as what we understand God, was not a little old man sitting on a cloud somewhere, but, if you will, the grandiose force of the universe. And this is important to understand, because the revelations and insights that were known in ancient times, here's the important point. Even though they could not be so revealed or welcomed in those ancient times, well, when the masters of those schools passed away, the knowledge, the revelation, the insight, the wisdom never passes away. That stays in the collective consciousness of humanity. And as such, the wisdom, the knowledge, the universal truths that was experienced by the biblical prophets, we see, whether you like to admit it or not, echoes of this all around the world in every spiritual tradition and culture. Yes, you have external forms, which are, of course, rather, what can I say, parochial. And these forms, what we call in Hebrew, pshat, of course, are contrary and contradictory and mutually exclusive. But underlying all, like the words of Isaiah, Malo kol haaretz kavodo, like the words of the Shema, Hashem Eloheinu, Hashem Had, right? Unity, singularity. Most of the spiritual traditions around the world recognize that underlying all the differences, there is that one underlying singularity. In our Torah, we, Kabbalah, if you will, of course we call that God, but the Kabbalah gets really defined and refers to that as the Ein Sof, the ultimate essence, the ultimate source, the source of sources. And in different schools of Judaism, whether it be Maimonides or the Zohar, it's referred to by different names, but it's ultimately the same reality. And surprisingly, many of the other traditions around the world. Of course, Christianity in its own way embraces and understands that. Certainly Islam does. And you might be surprised to know, so does Hinduism, Buddhism. Many of the Eastern religions also have a concept of the ultimate reality. Well, everybody calls it by its own name. And this is almost like a genetic revelation, a genetic memory in the collective consciousness of human beings. With that understood, recognize that that which the biblical prophets knew and understood as an elite did not die with the ending of their schools. The schools of the biblical prophets pretty much have continued to this very day. Granted, they have gone through their own evolutionary cycles and, of course, are called by different names, but it's pretty much the same stuff. And it's pretty much what, of course, we teach here at our KosherTorah school. The emphasis, of course, is on universality and experience. Remember our motto, experience is power. So now, I want to review with you the stories in 2 Kings chapter 6. Like I said, the stories of the arrow, the axe, the army, and the like. And I want you to remember that these stories are predicated upon certain types of concepts and ideas. These concepts and ideas known to the biblical prophets seeped into the collective consciousness from them and from other sources, and have permeated the minds of human beings ever since. And since these times, you will have, if you will, echoes of this bubbling to the surface in all different ways and means and forms of human creativity and imagination. Even in the arts, certainly in the sciences, you have discoveries, revelations, and insights, which are not necessarily new. And that in itself was not an insight that was not noticed by none less than King Solomon. Remember he said, good old wise words, there's nothing new under the sun. Yeah. All the revelations and wisdoms that we're going to have already been there. Somehow, somewhere, somebody already picked them up. So through the centuries, what the ancient biblical prophets knew, regardless of how much their schools could be repressed or themselves killed or scattered or whatever, the knowledge will always come back. Like seeds planted in the ground, they will always reblossom. So, moving to modern times. This is one of the great things that I love about our day and age. We live in what I can call the era of imagination. Since the last, give or take, 100 years, we have had, of course, the existence of that which we call the motion picture. And before that, we had very, very imaginative writers who could come up with fantastic stories. We've only seen these things elevated in our day and age. So, of course, one of the greatest stories told in modern times had its origins with the Hollywood director George Lucas. And, of course, I'm speaking about the movies of the Star Wars series. Now, from what I understand, the Star Wars series of films is only second. It's the second biggest franchise in movie history. It's made $10 billion or more. I think the only one made even more than that was like James Bond or something, but they had like, I don't know how many films. But anyway, the point is, George Lucas, go study the history of how George Lucas developed Star Wars. And of course, you all know the story of Star Wars. There is something in the universe called the Force. And the Force permeates all life. And there is this band of brothers and sisters who are those who can bond with this Force and therefore channel it into the world. They're called the Jedi Knights. But of course, you have the bad guys who can channel the Force and use it in a negative way. They're called the evil Sith Lords. Well, remember, like I said, if you want to look back to the Bible as stories, as opposed to the history as we of faith embrace it, then you would look at the man like a Moses and you would say, gosh, if that's not a Jedi, I don't know who is. And you would look at Balaam and you'd say, gee, if that's not a Sith Lord, I don't know who he is. I can tell you somebody else who was, Laban. Now, I use the modern examples of fiction. Why? Someone said, well, why don't you just talk Torah? Well, in all due respect, I am. But you don't recognize, like the Bible says, Isaiah chapter 6, Malo kol haaretz kivodo. The world is full of God's kavod. And the kavod, or glory of God, is his word, which is the Torah. So no matter where you go, no matter where you look, you're going to find Torah. Let's take a time machine back, way, way back, to one evening in June, if I'm not mistaken, 1977. I was in college at the time, and some of my buddies came and said to me, hey, did you hear about this new movie called Star Wars? And I said, no. I said, you gotta go see it. You're gonna love it. Okay, fine. So, in those days, you couldn't go online and buy tickets in advance. In those days, you actually had to go to the theater, wait in line, and buy a ticket. Well, the lines for this movie were literally around the block. The only time I could get in to buy it, to get a ticket, I remember it was a Thursday midnight showing. All right, Thursday night at midnight, and the whole theater was packed. I was one of the last guys in. But for those of you who've ever experienced Star Wars in the theater, especially in the day, when they first originally introduced Dolby sound and the big screen and the like, it was mesmerizing from the first moment to the last. That's what made Star Wars such a tremendous hit. But the big deal about Star Wars, of course, was the talk of the Force. Remember, the Force flows through you and all the rest. And Obi-Wan Kenobi was going to train Luke Skywalker, blah, blah, blah. That's lovely myth. But something inside touched me very deeply. I resonated with that message. And remember, at the time I was in college, I was already religious. I was already a student of Torah. I already had interests in Kabbalah, awareness of, and interest in, but it was before I moved to Israel. And I was convinced that the whole concept of the Force must have been based upon the Kabbalah. And that the character of an Obi-Wan Kenobi must have been what I perceived to have been a Kabbalist. I don't know how true that was in the eyes or minds of George Lucas. Okay, there were many people involved in the project, the producers, some of the writers who were Jewish. I don't think any of them were religious. But somehow, some way, the stories of the Bible, which they probably would have looked at as much myth as the fiction they were writing, somehow, through the ethers that be through the collective consciousness, might have bubbled into the back of their mind without them even realizing it, and inspired them to create the stories and the portrayals that they did. In psychology, we call this archetypes, in which those, if you will, memories of the past never ever disappear, but always seem to rise to the surface in different ways and in different forms. Now, years later, when The Empire Strikes Back came to the screen, I was already a Ben Torah, studying in the yeshivot, studying actually Kabbalah and Bet-El, which big Kabbalistic thing. And The Empire Strikes Back came, and I desperately wanted to see that film. Came to Jerusalem. I remember, and I've told this story many a time, that I had to sneak out of my house at the time because, God forbid, a religious person would never go to a film. And I snuck into the theater, and I saw it. And again, when I saw the scenes of Master Yoda teaching Luke Skywalker the ways of the Force, and how he was saying you have to feel it flow through you, and like those words resonated very deep within me. I was reinforced in my conviction that the whole concepts there were Kabbalistic. And the following day, you might have heard me tell the story. I went and challenged my rabbis at Bethel, saying, okay, you guys aren't teaching me the real deal. I don't feel anything. Where's the Force? And I've told this story a number of times, not going to elaborate on it right now. But it eventually sank into their minds that I tapped into something. And they didn't know I got it from a movie. I wouldn't even know what it meant to have gotten it from a movie, but I did. God works in strange ways. And that is when I got introduced or directed towards Rabbi Meir Levi, Alav Shalom, my Rebbe, who taught me the one-on-one and taught me to use that modern term, the ways of the Force. But now, historically, realistically speaking, George Lucas, most likely, from all the interviews and research I've done, based the principles and concepts on Eastern religious teachings. At least so he says. No reason to doubt. But the point that I'm trying to get at here is you'll notice the similarities, the universality of it all. And that is why our stories of the Bible, even for the religious skeptic, the one who wants to, from his own or her own prejudicial point of view, definitively declare and state the Bible is myth and fantasy and legend and it never happened. You know, there are always those who say that. You're not going to argue with them. You're not going to fight with them. Whatever proof of historicity is there, and they're either going to look at it or not. Fine. Dramatic pause for you to stop and think. But the archetypal realities of the stories, their underlying message, historical or not, are as 100% valid in the universality of things. So therefore, the Bible is very much real. It is very much valid. And its historicity doesn't add to or subtract from that validity. And that is how you need to come to understand the Tanakh. So that when you come to study the Bible, the challenge of the secular, that state is historical, it's legendary, it's irrelevant. It's not what's important. The message is what's important. And that is what is being taught here. The value of archetypes. So, of course, today, well, let me rephrase. No, I better say, like I said, I'm thinking three thoughts here at once. I was about to say, as you know, there really is no such thing as a Jedi order. It's fictional, right? It's fictitious. But I had to stop in my mind. Why? Because many of you may or may not be aware that people have actually created a religion, a modern day religion called Jediism, in which they base upon the fictional account as described in the Star Wars movies and extracted from it their own philosophical construct, which has become their religion. No, I don't think they believe that Yoda, Master Yoda and Obi-Wan were actual, historical personages, but they take the universal ideas out of it, the archetypes, and they create something. Well, where did it all come from? You take a look in the Eastern Oriental traditions, the Taoist tradition, Buddhist, and some even the Hindu traditions. But ours predates them by centuries. So, here are the curious stories that chapter 6 has to offer us. Okay? You can read them for yourself. You don't need me to read, and that's why I don't like reading line by line, word for word. I don't want to go in that type of a Bible commentary. If you want that, there are plenty of other rabbis and books out there that can help you with that. My job, my focus is the prophetic way, is to give you insight and tapping into the force, the real force, the underlying energetic reality which makes these stories real. So on that note, chapter 6. the story opens, and this is why we don't need to get into all the elaborate details, right? It says here that the children of the prophets, they want to go, the place where they're staying isn't working for them, so they want to go someplace else and build themselves some other place where they can go and do their studies, their learning, and the like. Fine. So they are all going, and they're cutting down trees because they have to build. And as one was cutting down the tree, the axe blade, which in Hebrew is called barzel, iron, fell off and falls into the water. And, well, you know what iron does in water, don't you? It floats because it has wings, right? No, it sinks. You know that. So it sunk. And, of course, they're freaking out. Why? Well, you got to remember something. In ancient Israel, they did not have a Home Depot or a Lowe's. And the local, whatchamacallit stores, they weren't around. When you had an axe head or any other kind of tool, these were hard made. They were worth a lot of money. So when this thing sunk to the bottom of the water, they freaked out. And it says, oh my gosh, this is borrowed. We're going to have to pay back. Remember, financial obligations, responsibilities. We discussed this in our previous class. So, what do? I guess you could always jump into the water and go look for it. So, they turned to, who did they turn to? Who did they turn to? They didn't turn to Elisha. They turned to the man of God. They give him a title as opposed to a name. And he says, all right, show me where it fell. And he says, give me a piece of wood, throws it in, the axe blade floats. All right? I can see it. Just like, if you will, the portrayal in the Star Wars movie called The Empire Strikes Back, in which, if you remember, Master Yoda, the character, has to elevate Luke Skywalker's spaceship, his X-Wing fighter, which sunk into the bog. And if I'm leaning back here to portray in the movie, he reaches out with his hand, and George Lucas's melodic, music comes over, and you see Yoda going like this, and all of a sudden it rises out of the water. Pretty slick. How do you think the Bnei Nevi'im thought when the axe head rose out of the water? Now, don't think of it, they weren't as impressed as with an X-Wing. They don't know what an X-Wing was. They certainly wouldn't even know what a little green guy like Master Yoda was. But they saw something that was supernatural. They saw something that Elisha had accomplished. Now, let's be honest. Our text does not say Elisha put out his hand and beautiful music was in the background. Come on, that's movie stuff. But here was the reality of something supernatural. What is the nature of the wood? I don't know. Now, some on a rationalist point of view could say, wait, this is barzel, which is iron. Maybe it needed to be magnetized. Maybe what Elisha put in there had a magnetic property and it was magnetically drawn. Well, maybe. I wasn't there, but the text certainly doesn't say that. The text indicates that Elisha had a power and an ability. Not necessarily like the magic of a Jedi. Remember, a movie is meant to entertain. So it has to be larger than life. Excuse me. And of course, John Williams' melodic music to it. This guy's not divinely inspired. Did you ever listen to John Williams' just music? Wow. This guy is an amazing guy. Somehow, somewhere got into his, tapped into him. And he's come out with some of the most, inspirational music of the last, 50 years maybe? Indiana Jones, Star Wars, I think he did, so many others. Go look up the guy's career. Brilliant, brilliant man. But anyway, it stretches out. I says, here it is. Go take it. It's a pretty slick trick, right? It sounds like something that would have been portrayed later, because that's exactly what it was. Now, the one thing that I liked about the Star Wars version, which we don't have here in the Bible. But remember, a story's a story, and I learn from one story to the next regardless. We accept the Bible as history, no question about that. But you might remember from the storyline in Star Wars. Yoda, of course, raises up the spaceship, and Luke Skywalker's response is, I don't believe it. And again, he originally tried to do it himself, and he couldn't. And that's why Yoda did it. And of course, Luke says, I don't believe it. To which Yoda responded, and that's why you failed. I can see that kind of a message, even though it's not in the Bible in this place. But the power of emunah, faith, is permeated throughout Tanakh, the Bible, and of course in later traditions. Of course, you may be familiar with a very famous teaching of a later prophet, Habakkuk, who plays into our Eliyahu connection here. Go check it out. You'll see where. He made a very famous statement, Tzadok be'emunato yichiyeh, that the righteous live by faith. And in the Gemara, in Tractate Makot, it states that if we could sum up all the commandments of the Torah, we would sum it up in just that one statement of Habakkuk. Faith, emunah. And there's a lot in it, because emunah, unlike in other religions, it's not a statement of or a proclamation of a theological or philosophical idea. I believe in A, B, C, D, E, F, G. No. Faith is what you live. Faith is your actions. Faith is your deeds. I'll give an example. A very, very famous story is told in the Gemara of one of the masters of this school, whose name was Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa. It is said that in his day, there was this nasty, poisonous snake that was literally attacking people in a certain area and, killing them with its venom. And they turned to him, Rabbi, please help us. So what does he do? Does he call upon the name of the Lord to strike the snake dead? No. He says, show me where the snake's pit is. They found the snake's pit. He stuck his bare foot down the snake's pit. And the snake bit him on the foot. What do you think happens when you get bit by a poisonous snake? Well, that's true. It died. That's right. Oh, no. Not Rabbi Hanina. He didn't die. The snake died. He pulls out the dead snake. He was able to permutate and push out the poison. He had that power. The force was strong with this one. And legend says he takes the dead snake, brings it back into town, and says, remember, it's not the poison of the snake that kills. It's the, if you will, the lack of faith, right, that kills. It's the sin, he said, actually, that kills. It's our own blemish. It's our own inside or internal problems. Remember, curious thing, the lack of faith in Hebrew is called safek, or doubt. And safek, doubt, is the same numerical value as the name of the enemy of God called Amalek. Amalek has to be wiped out. The lack of faith, safek, has to be wiped out. That's a great message. So, something? A lot of you want the Bible story to be so separate from the rest of reality. But it's not. And the fictional story of Star Wars, whether Mr. Lucas knew it or not, is just a modern telling of the ancient biblical story. Archetypes. Mr. Lucas may never have read the biblical story, may never have known it, may deny it to this day, doesn't matter. Archetypes speak. And the power that we call God, Mr. Lucas called the Force. And the Force was strong with Mr. Lucas and led him to put all of these little symbols in his movies, which echo the truths, the biblical truths of what was there thousands of years ago. So that when people today come to the Bible, somehow in the back of their minds, they're connecting the dots. And they're looking at the stories of Eliyahu and Elisha, and they're seeing them, oh, they were Jedi. Maybe we should say that the fictional characters, the Jedi, are based on the biblical prophets. This way, that way, that way, this way, it's not what's important. The teachings and the message and the lesson is what is important. Let's continue in our story. Let's continue in the story of the Bible here. Again, 2 Kings chapter 6. It states now that the king of Aram, which was Syria, all right, he's waging a war with Israel, and he's holding counsel with his servants. All right, I want to set in, my troops. So let's put it in secret. And it says here, the man of God. Again, not given a name, but a title. He's something bigger than himself. This is not Obi-Wan talking. This is the Jedi Knights, if you will, the prophets, the man of God. And he sends his message to the king of Israel. Hey, be careful going there. There's a trap. Okay? So the king of Israel checks out what he says, and there it was. Not just once, but twice. All right? Not just once and not twice. So now the king of Aram, he's getting a little ticked off, saying, all right, who's spilling the beans here? We got a mole. We got a plant. Somebody's messing with us. All right? Who's telling them? And one of his servants says, no. He says, there is this Navi, this Elisha guy. And he tells the king of Israel the words that you speak in your bedroom. You know what we call that, don't you? Dramatic pause. In modern lingo, we call that remote viewing. Elisha, through astral projection, knew and understood how to go into the presence of the king of Aram at any time. Remember, you could transcend space and time. So, for example, let's say that Elisha was alive right now as we give in the class, and he's sitting next to me here. And we say, Elisha, the ancient king of Israel needs to know what was going on. So he says, one moment, goes off into his meditative trance, travels in space and time, goes and sees what the king of Aram is doing, because it's all in the collective consciousness of things, picks it up, and he goes and gives a message to the king of Israel. Yeah, remote viewing. Today, this is a big deal. A lot of people in the military, of course, have been using this. Wouldn't it be great if we could psychically send a spy in Moscow and check out what's in the secret KGB files? Don't think they're not doing it to us. Their psychotronic warfare is probably a lot more advanced. But remember, all of this stuff comes from here. Our tradition says it actually comes from Mount Sinai. Now that is a profound revelation and insight. Indeed, there's a teaching that states all prophecy comes originally from Mount Sinai and then materialized in space and time as was necessary. The energy, the revelation, the connection to the active being, the sentient consciousness, the cause of cause, or the force behind all form. So you see, our biblical prophets, they had all this stuff. They were the quintessential Jedi. Thousands of years before that fictional idea arose in the mind of Mr. Lucas. So a long, long time ago, in a place very, very far away, there really, really, really were Jedi Knights. No, not the fictional kind, the biblical kind. And that's what we need to understand. That when we look and watch modern movies on television and the like, and look at what they're tapping into, good and evil. A lot of evil, bad stuff is out there today. Got to watch out for that, because that will seduce you to the dark side of the force. All of these concepts, people today don't turn to the Bible. God says, not a problem. I don't need you to turn to the Bible. God was behind the creation of mass media, mass entertainment, and allowed his teachings to permeate into the minds and the imaginations of all the creative people, be they in Hollywood or Bollywood or wherever else, to express in different forms the underlying universal teachings. That is the reality in which we're living now. And in the wise words of Pirkei Avot, Hafuch ba v'hafuch ba dekula ba. Flip it over once and flip it over again. It's all there. You check out what I'm saying in all the different sources. You'll see it's true. Let's move on with our story. So the king of Aram says, all right, find out where this guy is. And he says, okay, he's staying in a town called Dotan. And he sends their horses and chariots with a great army at night, and they surround the city. The man of God rises early, goes out and sees all the army surrounding. Didn't stress him out at all. Didn't care. Right? So, there's an army. What power does one man have over an army? Well, let's see what happens next. Okay? His attendant comes out, freaks out. Alas, my master, what shall we do? He goes, don't worry. Everything's all right. Those who are with us are more numerous than those who are with them. Elisha prayed, Lord, open up his eyes and let him see. Okay? The Lord opened the lad's eyes, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of fiery horses and chariots around Elisha. He saw an army of angels. Dramatic pause. What did those armies of angels? What did that army of angels do? Did it smite the armies of Aram? Nope. Did it intimidate them? Nope. Did it do anything? Not according to our story. Not at all. But know something. The invisible armies. Remember the story of Yom Kippur, 1973, where the invading Syrian forces and later stories of invading Egyptian forces claim that they also saw curious armies which weren't there before. What did they see? It's led them to surrender and retreat. That is modern historical military fact. What they saw? Who knows? What this lad saw? Who knows? But what happened next is what is most profound. You see, like it says in the book of Daniel, the watchers who are out there, how do they wage war? The watchers do not strike you with lightsabers from behind the scene. They don't send down fire from heaven and burn you up. They manipulate the minds of people. Just like Nebuchadnezzar, the watchers in Daniel manipulated his mind and brought him into a state of mental instability and illness. Now, look at the story that happens here. You remember the fictional version in the movie Star Wars? Where in the first movie, the original movie, Obi-Wan Kenobi is taking Luke and the droids to go to Alderaan. And they get stopped in their little speeder car, and this troops start talking to them. All right, where are these droids from? Obi-Wan Kenobi's character makes a little wave with his hand and says, these aren't the droids you're looking for. And the soldier says, these aren't the droids we're looking for. And he goes, Obi-Wan does it again with the little hand. You can go about your business, zippity-doo. And the guy says to his soldiers, yeah, you can go about your business. Obi-Wan again says, move along, with the hand stuff. And the guy repeats his words. And Luke says, what are you doing? And he says, the Force can have a strong influence over the weak mind. Those are true words. And here you have the biblical source for it. Look at what Elisha now does to the army of Aram. Remember, these are professionally trained soldiers. They're killers. They're tough, mean, lean, nasty machines. And they come down to him, and Elisha prays to Hashem, please strike this people with blindness. And he struck them with blindness according to the word of Elisha. Now, blindness means that it didn't go black, that they couldn't see anything, but rather it blurred them. Just like the fictional portrayal, the eyes of the soldiers to Obi-Wan were, in quote, blinded. So is this entire army of Aram. See from the biblical example the original seeds that blossomed through the ages and the centuries of storytelling to echo back to the biblical truths of the vision and truths of the biblical prophets. That is the message I'm trying to get across to you right here. So, following the story, they walk right up to Elisha. And you can see it as if this was an Obi-Wan Kenobi moment. In verse 19, neither is this the way, neither is this the city you're looking for. We're not the people you're looking for. This is not the city where you want to be. And follow me, I will lead you to where the man you seek. And they let him, all right? And they take him, cross country into Samaria. So remember, this is not a band of like 10,000. This is like the equivalent of a company of maybe 50, 100, like, Eliyahu with the mountainside. These are professionally trained recon soldiers. The tough, like Navy SEAL guys. They're tough guys, all right? They're trained and disciplined. And Elisha just gives them one of these, Jedi type of things. And they're completely oblivious not only to his identity, but to where they're at. These are the guys who sneak in there, recon. They know the land. They know the ground. And he is essentially taking them out of the backwoods directly into what? The capital, in which there is thousands of Israel soldiers there who, spot them and immediately surround them. So, it comes to Samaria. Elisha says, okay, open the guy's eyes. Let them see where they're at. The Lord opened their eyes. Behold, they're in Samaria. So now, they're surrounded. They're not naked with the surrender. So the king of Israel says to Elisha, all right, what shall I do? Interesting. My English translation has the king of Israel referring to Elisha as my Lord. I hate it when they translate things wrong. Because the Hebrew says, Avi, my father. They always referred to the Navi as a father kind of character, father type person, someone to look up to. And what do you think Elisha says? They're the enemy, wipe them out. No, it doesn't say that at all. Elisha understood very clearly the ways and means of Hashem. The force? A little question mark there. All right, same thing pretty much. And he goes, no, don't slay them. Do not slay those you've captured with sword. Do you slay those you capture with sword and bow? You don't kill prisoners of war. Set food and water, let them eat and drink, and then send them home. Because they're the ones who are going to have to go back to the king of Aram. And says, yeah, we went to the city you sent us to. We surrounded the place. We captured the guy, and he somehow captured us. What do you think that sends as a message to the king of Aram? He sends in his crack seal, his SEAL team, and they get captured. They get wiped out. I mean, it's even more of a disgrace. If they died in battle, at least that would be, in quote, glorious. No. Fed, go home. What a disgrace. What a dishonor. Can you imagine the shame these guys had? That they're, well, let's put it in again, Star Wars language, that the Force or Hashem had such a strong influence over the weak-minded. It shows you where the real power in military might really is. And don't think that our militaries today don't know this very lesson. I don't know if they're going to acknowledge it from Elisha and the Bible, or they're going to point to Star Wars or Eastern Oriental religions. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter which direction they're taking from the source. But the source is, they recognize the power of the mind over matter. And most of warfare today is psychological. It's psychops. It's manipulating peoples, not necessarily through the force of arms, but through the force of persuasion. Like it says, the force has a strong influence over the weak-minded. And today, almost all of us are that weak-minded. If you take a look at what's happening now in current events in the summer of 2020, with the upheavals and things going on in societies around the world, ask yourself just how weak-minded people are, that they are submissive to and surrendering to the dark side of the force and everything that it indicates. Think about these things, because like I'm trying to get across to you, this is real. This isn't just a story. All right? I don't care if you believe the Bible or not. You're religious like me, of course we believe it. It's our faith, it's our history. But if you don't, it doesn't matter. Why? Because the psychological message, the psychic messages are valid. You accept them when you see it in Star Wars, and you're not willing to accept it when you see its source in the Bible? How about a little honesty here? So, after this, it says he gave him the feast, sends him home. All right? And the Aramean troops no longer continue to invade the land of Israel. How could you go back? Think about it. How could you go back knowing that you could be so easily psychically manipulated? You'll see this in many portrayals in science fiction and the like, wherein which you would be able to manipulate the mind of your enemy and confuse him to the point where he would misinterpret his own ally as the enemy, and they would attack one another. You see that happen in a lot of modern science fiction stuff. But read the prophecies in the Bible of the stories of Gog and Magog, of the war against Jerusalem and Zechariah, where it says every man's hands against his brother. You see the hand of the watchers involved, in which they strike as they do into the minds of people, confusing, misdirecting, causing them their own demise. So you see, yeah, you could pick up the gun, that's fine. You could pick up the sword, that's fine. And you think that that gives you strength and power, right? Remember, wise words, not spoken by Elisha, but his sentiment was surely there, echoed later in the words of the character Obi-Wan, that the Force has a strong mind. The Force has a strong influence over the weak mind. Very archetypally, psychologically true. A biblical fact. Take this into account. Okay, it says after that Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram, mustered all of his army and goes to besiege Samaria. He's a little ticked off. All right, the story then goes to speak of the great famine and all the weird stuff that's going to go on. The king is totally, frankly angry, thinks that Elisha is to be held responsible because, I mean, good Lord, if the prophet can do all this stuff, how come he can't stop this? So here's the interesting thing, all right? You'll see the prophet Elisha comes and gives the prophecies. It's going to all be over in such a day, and we'll cover that in our next class or 2 classes. But the point is, people have such a misconception of spirituality. They think that the, in quote, Kabbalist, the master, can magically cure all the world's ills, right? If we only had a Kabbalist, he would have stood up against Hitler like that. If only we had a Kabbalist, they'd wipe out all the blah, blah, this and that. It doesn't work like that. Didn't work like that for Eliyahu HaNavi. Doesn't work like that for Elisha. It is a higher hand that ordained, if you will, the forces and the powers that be. And the Navi, above and beyond all things, is first but an Ebed, an Abed, a servant. He is called Ish HaElohim, as opposed to Ebed Hashem. Ebed Hashem means a servant of God. That is one who is able to receive the power. But an Ish HaElohim is the one who is able to activate that power and project it out into the world. In later Kabbalah, one who receives what's called Or Yashar, or descending light, whereas the master, who knows how to project it, projects what's called Or Hozer, or ascending light, cyclical type of thing. So that's why Elisha is always called this man of God, and he has the power. And again, as we'll see from that example, you diss him, you lose. Because there is always the overlap of the universal with the relative. And that's the stories here. So I want you to understand here, this, and giving a little bit of time stamping to ourselves. This is the week of Tisha B'Av, the fast which commemorates the destruction of the temples in Jerusalem. There are a lot of stories, a lot of legends. Doesn't matter. All we know for sure, temples ain't there anymore, simply because people created their own realities, which led to their own demise. They caused and brought upon their own heads what they did, both with the destruction of the first temple and the destruction of the second temple. What does God do about it? He rescues his Torah and allows it to disseminate around the world, all ways and means, all different kinds of vessels. Remember Elisha, the miracle with the oil, put the oil in all the different vessels? Well, think of the oil as the Torah, and it's in all the different vessels. And the likes of a George Lucas is being filled with the oil of the Torah. He doesn't even realize it. Maybe he thinks he's being inspired by the Shaolin because that's the thoughts in his head. He might not even know. He might not even know that the examples that he used in his films have their echoes right out of the Bible. He might not even know. Maybe to this very moment. Fine. You know. Years ago, I knew. I experienced it. I felt it. And it helped direct my life as God guided me through those inspirations. And if you look around in your personal lives to this day, you'll find those same inspirations there yourselves. Don't be so quick to dismiss them. Don't make divisions in between religious, not religious, secular. This is everything comes from God. And if you seek God, you'll find God. Because God's in everything, if you look carefully enough. Okay, on that note, I got the message across. I hope you all picked up on it and do something with it. And that's it. For those of you who are going to fast, have an easy fast. Remember, this year, 2020, social hygiene is obligatory on the fast of Av, which we normally don't wash. This year, you wash your hands with soap and follow all necessary healthcare guidelines. If you need to wear the mask, you wear the mask. You do that stuff. That's not a battle you need to fight. Just do it. Who cares? All right? If it protects you, fine. And if it doesn't, nothing lost. Do what needs to be done. Learn the lessons of the biblical prophets. Live them. And remember the wise words of the great sage Hillel. We might not be biblical prophets, but we are their children. And their spirit lives in us. Whoever you are, wherever you are. If you are, then that spirit lives in you. Let's conclude on that note. Ariel Tzadok here from the KosherTorah School. See you all in our next class. Shalom.